Taifa 1 had two broad objectives. The first one is to build a value proposition for the upstream. Taifa 1 was developed in support with one of the startup companies. Some of you might know of Sayari Lab. So the intention was to help the ecosystem understand that there is the potential for them to contribute to the sector. The challenge that we are extending to our ecosystem is, do we have companies that can explore the possibilities of doing their own constellation themselves? Because we need our data.
One, we are up. Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Geo Habari podcast. I'm your host, Yariwo Kitio, and I'm pretty excited about this new episode. This week's episode revolves around the Kenya Space Agency, and we're going to get a view of the guests that we have on here today. So we're going to talk about sort of the behind the scenes of what goes on in terms of their recent projects, capacity building, and also gaps within the geospatial industry sector when you're talking about data and accessibility. We'll also briefly touch on Taifa 1 as well. This was quite remarkable last year when we launched Taifa 1, and we'd also want to know the plan around that when it comes to data and also the pipeline around putting in data protocols that create a more thriving ecosystem locally within Kenya. That's the conversation. But before we get into the episode, I'll have our guest introduce himself. Hi, Charles, and then we'll jump right into the behind the scenes of what Charles actually does.
Hey, Rio, and allow me to call you May. So my name is Charles Mwangi. I'm the Acting Director, Space Sector and Technology Development. I'm again excited to be invited in this conversation, where I hope to share a bit more of what you're doing at the agency and what we have in the coming days in terms of our applications, in terms of what you're doing in the different segments of the market. Happy to get into this conversation.
Thanks, Charles. I think maybe, Charles, for a start, when we say we have a Kenya Space Agency, what does that signify? Of what importance is it to have a space agency, basically?
Yes, it means that we can spend more money and go to space. But that is on a lighter touch. The reason why we have an agency is because we want to organize ourselves and coordinate our activities so that we're able, as a country, to derive value from the space ecosystem. For those who might not know, the space ecosystem is organized in two main segments. You have what we call the upstream. We also have what we call the downstream. In the upstream, you're looking at satellite development, you're looking at launch, you're looking at ground receiver station, and that is what, in most instances, seems very interesting for people, because when you're launching rockets, the sound that it makes is always interesting. But more also importantly is what we call the downstream segment, where once we send the satellites out there and they send the data, what we do with the data that we receive. And we have multiple applications cutting across weather, forecasting, issues around Earth observation applications, essentially around flood mapping, around forest monitoring, agriculture, where you do crop yield estimation, developing land use, land cover maps, and other applications that you use for spatial planning. And the applications are very diverse. And that is what, again, as a Kenya Space Agency, we are seeking to consolidate efforts towards, so that now we organize these particular sectors so that we're able, as a country, to be able to derive value. So our mandate cuts across three elements. We have the element of promoting, we have the element of coordination, we have the element of regulation. And the promotion, we are seeking to deepen or to extend or to help the people understand why, as a country, we need to invest in that particular sector. So essentially, the agency has to build a value proposition for space, and the coordination, essentially bringing all the stakeholders together so that we are able to work together and ensure that we're able to maximize on the different strengths that we have. And then regulation, because again, we also want to de-risk space. So that now, if you have private sector players who want to get into the sector, then they feel comfortable to make the investment within this particular sector, so that, again, they're able to know there is the long-term sustainability of the operations within the sector. So I would say those are the three main elements that informed the need of the agency to be established.
You touched on a couple of interesting aspects, and I like that you've been able to tell us the difference between the upstream and the downstream. And I think I'd want us to go down into the downstream, right? And you've mentioned a couple of applications that are pretty exciting when you talk about Earth observation, right? Are there particular focus areas that you're looking at now as the Kenya Space Agency? Are there particular sectors you're really getting into to show the space value or show the value of using Earth observation or technology towards addressing these issues?
So at the agency, what we've done is we've been having conversations with multiple stakeholders in the different segments of the market. And the intention was to help us understand what are the gaps, what are the challenges, and what are the opportunities that we have within the space sector. Why are we not using as much of the geospatial data as much as we should? And what we've done is one of the approach was we decided that we would do a number of pilots. And the reason we are doing the pilots is to bring the stakeholders together so that we also understand how the ecosystem is organized.
When we talk about stakeholders, who are the stakeholders in this scenario?
So I'll give the example of we started with the mapping of the forest, and we had identified a pilot area for the abadeas. So in that particular sector, one of the key stakeholders is the Kenya Forest Service. One of the other stakeholders that we found also quite interesting to have is the Kenya Wildlife Service, because sometimes you find most of the forests are within areas under the control of the Kenya Wildlife Service. I'll give the example of the Abadeas where we did the study. So a segment of the forest is a game park or a game reserve, and the rest of the forest is under the Kenya Forest Service. So again, being the stakeholder within that particular ecosystem, then we engage that person. Then, of course, we also had another agency, the Department of Remote Sensing and Resources Surveys, that have been undertaking mapping of resources and using remote sensing data. We also brought on board the universities because, again, we were feeling that we also wanted them to be on board in terms of them understanding the processes and also trying to bring in the new ideas that they have in terms of the operation. We also brought in the Water Resources Authority because, again, part of the conversation was in terms of the water bodies that could be in that particular environment. We even also brought in the roads board because essentially we have roads and we needed to map out which would be the closest point where we would be able to collect the data. The reason why we were doing the pilots, it unravels opportunities of knowing stakeholders who sometimes we assume are not important, but are critical in terms of decision support in a particular area. So that is only one sector in natural resources, and again, only looking at the forest. But again, the other conversation we had was with urbanization, and then we did the mapping of Nakuru municipality. So we had to bring in the county government, we had to bring in the State Department of Housing and Urban Development. We had to bring in the State Department of Lands and Physical Planning. We had to bring in again the academia. We had to bring in DRSRS again because again of their remote sensing heritage. I mentioned the academia as well. So essentially, depending on the area that you're focusing on, the stakeholders kind of change. But one of the things that we've been trying to do is help now understand what their capabilities are, what their gaps are, and also more importantly, and I know we'll talk about data, enable them to understand why their data sets are required in the decision support and why it is important for them to share those data sets across the sector players.
Thanks, Charles. And I like that you've mentioned that because I want us to sort of change gears a bit. You've had this direct interactions with all these stakeholders. These are quite monumental departments and government ministries. Within this interaction, what would you say is sort of the gap between data, tech, and uptake? Then we can talk about what's the space agency doing with regards to these gaps.
It's very interesting to know that, and sometimes we, as a developing countries, we get accused that we don't have data. What we've realized is that there is quite a lot of data that is available. But the challenge that we face in terms of data is that data is not consistently collected. It is not stored centrally. So, meaning that if you have a project today, I collect the data, I do a report, and that is also one of the other challenges. Most of the data is converted into a report, and what we get is a report that is shared. And of course, the data that is behind the report is not usually made discoverable. And that is one of the elements that we found across the sector, where we have different agencies that are collecting data in a sporadic way, not storing that data in a repository where it can be accessed for other functions. So that is one problem in terms of not having a machine readable also data. So we are looking at setting up that ecosystem that allows that data to be discoverable. Because once the data becomes discoverable, the more data sets you have, the better insights that you're able to get from those data sets. So if you're able to have all these data sets in one location, And again, also trying to ensure, because the other issue is around quality, ensuring that this data is collected on a consistent basis. There is also quality checks that are done to ensure that there is a certain level of standard that it meets. Then it makes it easier for us to start drawing insights. And our understanding of the reasons why there has been low uptake of geospatial data sets is because of the cost implication in terms of on a regular basis having to send a team out there to collect the data. And most of the time, you also find that there is duplication. We collect similar data sets, and sometimes we could save a lot of effort if you were to consolidate this so that now if we have a centralized area, and I'll also give the example of the universities that do a lot of research. We have a lot of master's students, we have PhD students who are collecting a lot of data. And again, this data is in a report somewhere, this data is in a university somewhere that is sitting. But the value that you would be able to get, and the challenge that we're having as a developing country, is how then do we consolidate that? Because there's a lot of potential that we'll be able to unlock if that data becomes discoverable, it is in a usable format, and then it means that then you're able to build up applications on top of that, and then also be able to support the sector to be able to grow. And also in terms of policy making, being able to make decisions that are grounded on data.
The techies at the back have said amen. You've touched on all our data pain points. And I like that you've actually mentioned the issue of the data is not in a discoverable manner. And when you're talking about your setting up a system to make this data discoverable and consolidate all these efforts and bring it into a central repository, what does that look like for you guys and the plan behind that? Are you able to talk about that as well and what's in the pipeline for that?
Yeah, I can mention that, although it's still at the early stages. So we're looking at setting up what we're calling the data hub. So the data hub will have three components. It will have a data portal, it will have a data cube, and it will also have what you're calling the knowledge hub. So the data portal would essentially be able, based on the thematic areas, be able to consolidate data for, say, agriculture, for climate, for natural resource, for spatial planning, for disaster, arranged in that thematic area. And then we'll also have the general data sets, like what you normally call the base map. So that will be in a platform where, for ease of visualization, you can overlay two maps or three maps. Say you want to know the roads that are near a river. So you can have a layer that has the rivers, you can have another layer that has the roads. And then if you're doing maybe flood modeling, then you can easily see which rivers will affect which roads. That is one level of data set. Then we're also building a data cube. And the reason why the data cube is important is, as I know most of the people in the geospatial space would have interacted with the Google Earth engine. What that technology has offered is the potential of being able to build systems whereby that data is available, and then you're able to run scripts on that data without necessarily having to download, without having to pre-process the data. So you find analysis ready, data stored in a common repository, and then you just run scripts on that. And then the intention is also to pull the data that is available at the portal. So that allows someone who wants to make quick decision to be able to run those scripts. And what we've been able to do so far is get data for Landsat for the country. We are initially focusing in Kenya and then putting it in one location. Then the knowledge hub is essentially where we will have reports or best practice in terms of the processes. How do you process, for example, if you wanted to map out areas that has been inundated, areas that are under floods? Do we have a best practice that tells you this is the process that you need to follow? Because also one of the issues that has been affecting us in terms of decision making is having consistent methods that have been agreed upon. And one of the things that we are also hoping to have as we go along in terms of the thematic areas is to have what you're calling the communities of practice, where we have a set of professionals in one particular thematic area, say, give examples of spatial planning, where they come together and agree that this is the way that if you want to map out a town, this is how we'll do it. Even in terms, of course, there are issues around definitions of cities, definition of urban centers, market centers. But you see, if as a country, as practitioners, we agree in Kenya, this is how we're going to look at this particular topic. Then even in terms of data collection, so because if I classify a city differently from someone else who's also collecting the data, then that data cannot utilize the same data because essentially the definition is different. Of course, the other element you're looking at potentially later as we advance on is how do we govern the data processes.
You finished that sentence with governed data processes. Is it accurate to say that the Kenya Space Agency would also be responsible for setting data standards and protocols within the geospatial industry? Is that accurate? Or because it sounds like we'll have some level of control over how we are getting data?
Yes, we will have a say in that. And part of the conversation, again, it will not be us making that determination. We would want a scenario where the community, and talk about the communities of practice, the community sits together and then they agree these are our standards. This is the best practice. This is what we feel would be the best way to move the conversation ahead. And then once we have that guidance, then our role as an agency then would be now putting that information in a guideline or in a regulation that then formalizes that process. So that again, we don't appear like we are imposing standards on the stakeholders. But where there are no gaps and we feel there is need for those standards to be in place, then we'll of course have conversations, especially within the government agencies who might have relevant input. And again, one of the key bodies that deals with the data is the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, and agree on the modality. And of course, the latest body is the Office of the Data Protection as well. So that now all these bodies, we agree on a common stand. And of course, also ICT, the Ministry of Information, Communication and Technology has a role. And then we formulate a way. Of course, the stakeholders, the private sector also have a say. And that is why we are saying if you're able to go the direction of the community's practice, then it becomes way much easier because the community then prescribes for themselves what is the best way or which would be the best guidelines that they would be able to adopt.
I want us to go back a bit to the Earth observation, right, which is the downstream. As a country, we are not producing satellite imagery, not yet, right? We don't have concrete data on that. And so one of the things we do is sort of use the data that's available from like Landsat and all that. But I'd be interested to know if there's plans around equitable access to high resolution imagery for Kenyans, basically. Because currently 30 by 30 is what we all access. Sometimes that's not necessarily what we need. We need more high resolution data. And I'm wondering what's the role of Kenya Space Agency in bringing this into now the ecosystem and having equitable access to this data, and not just the 30 by 30, but more high resolution data that we're able to use around population dynamics, all those indicators that are very important for innovation and for research as well.
Thanks, me for that. And maybe if I can indicate also one of the reasons why the stakeholders, because again, the Kenya Space Agency was established through a multi-stakeholder forum engagement, was because the stakeholders then felt that we are spending a lot of money, especially as government agency, buying high resolution imagery for similar functions. So you would have, say, the Ministry of Agriculture buy high resolution satellite imagery for developing applications on agriculture, say crop type or crop yield estimation maps. And then you'd have the Ministry of, say, Lands and Physical Planning also getting from potentially the same vendor the same data set. And then that data is not shared across. So we thought, why not have an agency or an organization that can procure these services on behalf of government? So that now, especially, and I'm talking about government because again, the private sector might have other needs that we might not be able to serve. So then, if a government agency requires that imagery, we buy it once and then we store that and make it available for the other sectors. Meaning that even if you don't have, and again, the satellite imagery, the high resolution ones are quite expensive, meaning that if an agency might not have a high budget of being able to acquire that imagery, then if we have it on the archives, because essentially it is still the same taxpayers' money that has been used to acquire the data, then we make it available maybe at a reduced cost. Because again, the intention of what we are planning to do is maybe on a yearly basis have a base map or a mosaic of high resolution imagery for every year. And then now on a need basis, of course, there are projects that you might require imagery for a particular region for a particular period of time. And then we can acquire that. But that still becomes part of our archive. Then, of course, right now we are procuring. But we would also want to get to a scenario where if there is need for data, we have our instruments in place that would allow us to task. And part of that journey has begun. And you mentioned the Taifa one. And I know that it's an interesting conversation that everyone would also want to get into. At the Taifa One satellite, part of the reason why that is important is one, because we want the data, and again, also we also want to build an industry on the upstream. Because again, as miniaturization of technology or electronics has allowed the technology to become much cheaper and much smaller in size, allowing even developing countries to afford these kind of technologies. So again, part of the reason why we started with the Taifa One mission is to build that value proposition and say, even as a country, we can do it. And then, of course, the intention is also to attract the private sector within our region to try and see whether they can invest in that particular segment of the market.
You've mentioned something about miniaturization of technology that allows us to get into space and as developing nations. But I'm still going to ask this so that you put more words into that. Is that the reason why we're not playing in the big leagues, right? We are more invested in the micro or the nano satellites as opposed to the large scale satellites, right? And I think it would be interesting for you to just quote unquote school us on, nano satellites versus macro and why that was essentially the default direction we were taking. And I've seen it's actually a default direction for a lot of African countries. I think it's good to draw perspective on the conversations that go behind to deciding we are going the nano satellite way and not the macro satellite direction.
The reason partly why the different segment is sometimes informed by budgets, because the bigger you go, the more expensive it becomes. And again, when you're talking of big satellites, you're talking of a couple of billions. There are some, like the communication satellites, you're talking about double figures in terms of the billions, 10, 20, 30, 100 billions. And of course, now in the traditional way of technology, even the Earth observation satellites, the traditional ones like the likes of Landsat, even the Sentinels are quite expensive. You're also in the range of the billions. And of course, there is a market for that, because the bigger the satellite, the more functionality you are able to embed in that, meaning that you can have a sensor that is able to take many bands. For those in the geospatial space, you understand the issue about the number of bands, meaning that you're also able to have much higher resolution, or even in terms of because one of the other key elements is the battery power. And that is also partly what determines how, when you say a satellite will be in space for, let's say, 5 years, that 5 years is partly informed by the battery life. For those who have cars, they understand that the battery, because the satellites have to use the battery, then similar, I would say, to the ones of the cars, not directly, but similar. That is what, and of course, for the cars, you have to change them every 3 or 4 years, 2, 3, 4 years, depending on the type. The satellites also, because there is no one going out there to change them. That is why at the end of life, sometimes we give them 5 years. If sometimes you find that the batteries are still working, you've heard of missions that goes up to 10 years. So that is an important element in terms of the size. Of the sizing of the satellite. And what has happened in the nano satellite, you're talking about between maybe 0 to about less than 10 kgs. And you're talking of from a small size of what we call a CubeSat. A CubeSat is a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter. What we launched in 2018, the first Kenyan university nano satellite, was a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter satellite. What we launched as Taifa 1 was 3U. So the first one is called a 1U, one unit. And then the 3U is more like three of them stuck together. Which makes what we have, the 3U. So you have a 10 by 10 by 30 centimeter. And again, then you have the stage of the micro satellite, which again, you're looking at the tens and hundreds of kilograms. And then, of course, you have the bigger ones. So the demographic that you choose has also an impact in terms when you're launching, the cost is usually calculated per kg. So if you have a bigger satellite, then you pay more to launch. And it means that you will need a bigger vehicle to launch. And of course, now if you have a big satellite, most potentially you become the prime contractor for that rocket, meaning that you bear the cost. For the nano satellite, you're able to piggyback on the bigger satellite, and then the cost of launch becomes cheaper. And that is why even for Taifa 1, those who watched the Taifa 1 was not the main payload. We use the term payload for the different satellites that are being sent there. It was one, I think there were about 40, if I remember right. Like you join into a matatu, you have the main guy who owns the front seat. and then as we join in the middle, and then the cost becomes easier. And that is what has allowed developing countries, because if you're able to develop a smaller satellite and then you're also able to piggyback on a launch, then it means that the entry level has become lower for us, and that is what is allowing us to dream. And we want that dream again to get into our ecosystem, to understand that yes, space technology is expensive, but the value proposition for space technology is a lot. And if we lose out on that opportunity, then also we keep on lagging. And I'll give a basic value. I think it was last year, the space ecosystem or the space economy was, they indicated that the space was equivalent to about 4 to 500 billion dollars. A study that was done by one of the organizations in Africa said that our contribution to that space economy is about 20 billion, which is like, if I do my maths, I might not get it correctly, but it's about 5% of the economy, the African participation in the space economy. So if you get to the level of Kenya, it is still very minute. But again, you see, we have a pathway that we can now leverage on and maximize on, because we still have the needs for, say, for agriculture. If you want to advise the farmer on when to plant and how best, which are the right conditions and which crops to plant, then it means that we have to get into that technology. So that again, also it also allows us, also our techies, to be able to tap into those opportunities in the sector.
The direction for Taifa One, are you able to talk about some of the expected projects or expected outputs or use cases that we can get out of this in terms of trade-offs? The barrier to entry has been lifted off and now developing nations can get into space. But what does that mean when it comes to downstream and accessibility of data? What can we get out of it to inform policy and decisions locally? For Taifa One, for example.
So Taifa One had two broad objectives. The first one is to build a value proposition for the upstream. The Taifa One was developed in support with one of the startup companies. Some of you might know of Sayari Lab. So the intention was to help the ecosystem understand that there is the potential for them to contribute to the sector. Because if you look at one of the very well-known players in the market is Planet. Planet currently says that they are able to map the whole globe on a daily basis. If you Google and check out what their satellite looks like, they are not the big Landsat Sentinel kind of satellites. They are much more smaller, meaning that, and it's a private sector player. So the challenge that we are extending to our ecosystem is, do we have companies that can explore the possibilities of doing their own constellation themselves? Because we need our data. We don't mind buying, even if it's slightly more expensive, from a company, say, that is launching the satellites from Kenya or from our region in Africa, or maybe the initial focus could be looking at the Africa region. And one of the conversations that we are beginning, and it's a follow-up for the Taifa One, because Taifa One was more of tech demonstration. In terms of the data, the resolution is not very high, because again, we're also talking about 3U, the ones that I talked about, 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 30. So we're not able to get high resolution imagery. We're looking at maybe about, in terms of resolution, between Sentinel and Landsat. But again, what I was saying is, what we were building on is the value proposition of us being able, within our ecosystem, to develop those technologies. Then also, more importantly, is that you mentioned about Landsat. For example, Landsat, you get an image every 16 days. Sentinel, you get an image every 5 days because they have two satellites. But if the image was taken when there was cloud cover, that means that you don't have an image for a whole month. Then what happens when you only have those instruments? And again, those are instruments that have been made available by the generosity of the US government for the Landsat, ESA for European Space Agency for the Sentinel. What happens for countries that do not have their own capabilities? If those products or those systems are not available, then it means that you also become ineffective in terms of being able to plan your activities and also being able to task us at will. And that is what we were hoping that, and again, it's an ongoing conversation for the Taifa One. So in terms of application, of course, the data would find applications for broad applications that do not require high resolution. The ones that require moderate resolution, agriculture, still forest mapping, especially if it is from a large extent. We can still do a bit of spatial planning, but not as at the granular level that we would want to get to.
For the data, and you've mentioned some of the scenarios for like agriculture and all that, is that something that has started after you've launched the satellite? At what point do the use cases come in? Like for Taifa, for example, where we're saying it's a value proposition, right, in the upstream mainly, has the transmission started?
So that element is still ongoing, because what happens is that when you launch, then there's a process of what we call calibration and validation. We're able to receive the signals from the satellite, but in terms of the imagery being a process that has not been affected. But in terms of what we are envisioning is, we're not saying we will depend on Taifa One exclusively. We would be depending on it to fill a gap on other data sets that might be available. So the intention is to, again, use Taifa One to increase the data sets that are available, because one of the efforts that we're trying to do is, and I talked about the data cube, is make, say, for example, Landsat data available, Sentinel data available, or any other open source data available. And then again, we still now work towards getting engagement in terms of all the other data sets from that could be available, and also the ones that we might need to purchase, especially guided by the space ecosystem. But again, in terms of the applications, you talked about agriculture. One of the areas that we're currently focusing on is on agriculture. We're also focusing on spatial planning, and we have an ongoing project on agriculture. But the intention is not necessarily to only use Taifa One data, but essentially use, even if it is, procure high resolution imagery.
What's that project you have ongoing on agriculture? Are you able to talk about it in this episode?
Yes, I can give a highlight. So what we've tried to do, and part of the information, that the reasoning for us to be involved in this pilot project, was we asked ourselves as an agency, when we say that space technology or satellite data can be used for agriculture, then how then can we go to the level of being able to map out how that looks like, from being able to get the satellite imagery, or even if in this particular case we also got a bit of drone imagery, to the level where we're able to give an advisory to the farmer. And again, it doesn't necessarily to be asked directly. So what you're looking at the high level, we are looking at two levels of support. We're looking at the policy level support. We're also looking at the farmer level support. At the policy level support, we are looking at, are we able to give the policymaker what we call the land use, land cover, that tells you this area is bare ground, this area is under forest, this area is under trees, or this area is under farmland. And then once you're able to map out where agriculture, for example, is happening, then the next level will be to do crop type, where you're able to say, we are able to see bananas here, we're able to see coffee, we're able to see tea. Why is that important? Because, say, for example, a county wants to set up what they're calling the aggregation center. Then they are able to know this area is under coffee. We need to set up a center or a collection center. If it's dairy farming, then we need a milk collection center. And then, so that now the decision in terms of where they locate those centers then is informed by the data. Then the other element, of course, when you do land use, land cover, you also do the building footprint. Then they're able to know where their people are, where the utilities need to be provided for. If they've not been provided, you're talking about water, you're talking about power, you're talking about road. And then, of course, now going back to the crop type, once you identify the crop type, then you can also get to the level of crop condition. And of course, there is the element of crop yield estimation. Why is crop yield estimation important? Because it will help the government be able to know when you're bound to have a surplus, when you're bound to have a deficit, and then make interventions for that. That is at the policy level. And the farmer level, once we identify where the crops are and their current initiatives in terms of mapping where the farmers are, how then can we advise, again, combining the information, the satellite information with weather data? Tell the farmers, say, for example, we saw you are growing maize. Of course, maize have different, I don't know what to call them, brands or grades or species, but based on the particular species, each species has its own requirement, whether it is water requirement, the types of soils, and the like. So we'll be able to tell the farmer, look, your area that you want to grow your maize, we noticed that in the last 5 years, the rains have been quite erratic, and you're not getting the sufficient amount of rainfall that is required for that particular maize breed. Are you able to change to these other maize breed that would still be able to harvest your maize, but now use the breed that is able to meet that particular weather condition? or being able to say, no, in our view, you might need to change the crop that you're growing because the weather does not allow, or the soil conditions are changed not to allow you to be able to grow that. And again, what you're looking at, we are not in that particular segment, but what we're hoping to do is work with stakeholders, and we have been having conversation. It's a conversation that we've been getting into for those who even have been doing work on fertilizer optimization, monitoring the soil condition and the like. And we want to pull all this data together because the farmer does not care where the information comes from. What the farmer needs is to be able to get an advisory that is credible, that adds value, and also adds more coins to their pocket.
The broader African ecosystem, how do you envision KSA in terms of collaboration with other nations or with other partners outside of Kenya, for example? Where does that place us within the broader African conversation when it comes to space technology?
So we have an important role, although the agency is established to serve the Kenyan market. But again, we also see the role going beyond the Kenyan market because, again, if you have to create an ecosystem, if you're able to deepen or grow the ecosystem within the African region, then it also creates opportunities for the Kenyans who are in this particular country and to a bigger market. And they, of course, they have been the conversation of having Africa as a free trade area. So some of the conversation we are having, and they are ongoing. We have, I think, two projects that we're working with Egypt and Uganda on developing 6U satellite. The other one is a climate camera that will be hosted at the International Space Station. So the reason why we are collaborating in such is to also build the tech around the upstream. And then the other conversation we're also having is sharing, especially in terms of the best practice. We've been having conversation with our colleagues from South African National Space Agency, Rwanda Space Agency, conversations also with the Space Agency in Nigeria, the Space Agency also in the Egyptian Space Agency, and even the Angolan Space Agency. And the reason why we're doing that is because if you're able to consolidate effort and learn from where our best practice, because most of our challenges and opportunities, they are similar across Africa. And that would also allow us to grow our market. I mentioned about the economy in terms of the value proposition for the space economy for Africa, where we're only contributing 5%. And if you are to look at the applications, it means that we're also depending a lot in the solutioning from outside the Africa region. If we can increase that percentage, and the way we increase that percentage is one, allowing the techies to know that there are opportunities. There's what we call the spin in, allowing it could even be the IT sector. And we had one trial, we were doing a land cover a mobile app. We gave that as a grant to the techies in the IT sector who are developing mobile apps. And the reason why we did that was we wanted to see whether we can interest those in the IT sectors to see the opportunities that are within the space domain. One of the other things that we'll also be looking at is how then do we also spin out those technologies. And of course, one of the other areas that we're looking at is how do we leverage on AI? Of course, the conversation previously was on big data, but are we able to leverage on these technologies to create a value proposition? And we can't do that if you're only focusing on a small market like Kenya. It would add a lot of value when we increase that value across the region so that now people from, again, the different parts of the African continent, then we are able to create the solutions. Because, and you mentioned that earlier, it is us who know where the problems are. And if we are able to onboard the techies or the people who are developing the technology to understand what the problems are, then it becomes very easy for them to develop solutions that will address our needs. And one of the gaps that I also notice with the techies is that sometimes they get very excited and carried away by the technology, and then they forget that the technology is supposed to provide a solution. And if you're able to bridge that gap between them being able to, because again, even the private sector, one of the things that we're also exploring as an agency is how do we bring in the private sector into this conversation? Because even in the US, even in Europe, you've seen a lot of conversations in terms of the startups getting into the sector. These days, you hear more of SpaceX than you hear of NASA. And of course, those are the conversations that we'd also want to. Because one of the things I also say is that as government, we are supposed to create an environment to allow our ecosystem to thrive. And that ecosystem can also be majorly driven by the private sector. And we hope to see that the private sector playing its active role. And again, by extending the market to the Africa region, then of course we grow the sector across.
Thanks, Charles. And in the process of us creating this thriving ecosystem and in the advent of all this technology, you've mentioned AI. I think human capital is pretty important, right? And I would say local people would understand the problem more than anyone else would. Are there plans or strategies or opportunities, pipelines that Kenya Space Agency is working on to create more opportunities? I don't know if that's something that is still within the conversation for young people or that's beyond this particular conversation within the space agency.
One of the three main issues that has been raised in terms of our space ecosystem is do we have, again, you talked about the data. The other element we talked about the infrastructure. Then the other element that we need to look at is the technical competence to be able to utilize the infrastructure that can be put in place and being able to process the data to be able to gain the insight. And human capital development is critical for us. And what we're doing at the agency is one, we're looking from the primary level to the secondary level. We've set up what we're calling the Space Club. We're focusing on three thematic areas. We're looking at Earth observation, we're looking at IT and robotics, we're looking at astronomy and space science, we're looking at space systems engineering. And the reason why we're doing that is we noticed there was a gap in terms of that content being available for a local ecosystem. Content that the kids anywhere in, say, Machakos or in Wajir, that they can relate to. And that is what we are seeking to do, providing age appropriate content. And then because we feel that would also help them understand, say, what space is. Because most of the time when you talk about space agency, people only think about it in terms of launching satellite. But again, the market is also quite big across. So we're looking at that demographic. Of course, the other demographic we were looking at is the universities. And what we did is we started offering research grants. We started in 2020, 2021. And one, we focused again on the upstream because, again, we felt there is not too much depth. Currently, we don't have dedicated satellite engineering, even degree courses in the country. But we, of course, have a strong heritage on the traditional engineering disciplines, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering. And those are some of the courses that you could find your own segue into satellite engineering. So the research grant is supposed to help us catalyze and also have the conversation going and also challenge the universities on the possibility of them developing curriculum that is able to address the growing need for the space ecosystem. Then also more importantly is also looking for opportunities beyond, because we also understand that we don't have a strong heritage on space. Then can we leverage on the existing opportunities that are in the international fora? And what we do is we are looking for opportunities even for masters, for PhD, for the from our partners, and I'm not going to name them now, from our partners across, because it's not only one country that we're looking at. We're having multiple conversations to try and see whether we can get opportunity to send one or two engineers that can get that technology or can get that technology transfer. And hopefully we'll not lose them completely, or even if they go out there, then they'll still be able to share the knowledge back to allow us to grow our space ecosystem.
What has been the most exciting project you are a part of that you're still really excited about and you are proud of since you got into this space, and why it was your most exciting initiative or engagement?
There are quite a number, but again, I would say I was partly involved in the development of the first Kenyan space object, what we're calling the first Kenyan university and satellite precursor flight. It was called Icons PF. Why that was important is because it is Kenya's first space object, and it opened the door to many of the conversations that you're having today in terms of where we could go. Because again, we stopped then looking at that kind of technology as foreign to us into something that we can potentially be able to do. And of course, the Taifa one is a continuation of those conversations. We've had research grant that was also informed. The ones that we did on nanosatellite development were also informed by that entry. So in my view, that has unlocked a lot of potential. And that made, irrespective of how small it was, it made Kenya a spacefaring country. And we are hoping that we're going to build up on that legacy. Then other projects that I am really looking forward on making it operational is that on data. Because I feel if you're able to consolidate the data set, create a vibrant data ecosystem, it will unlock a lot of potential. Because I look at it in terms of if, say, for example, we consolidated all the data sets and we committed as organizations also in government to make certain data sets common on a regular basis. That would allow the private sector to have the ones who are developing mobile apps to have APIs that queries the data from these platforms, meaning that the people who are developing solutions, then it becomes way much cheaper. The entry level becomes way much cheaper. And then we also get to the level where we start developing solutions internally. And that, in my view, having a functional data ecosystem would unlock a lot of potential and opportunities, especially also for the young people.
Oh, thank you so much, Charles. And congratulations on being part of the first team that launched the first space object for Kenya. So, congratulations on that. And it was really amazing having you. Thank you for giving us an inside scoop on what's happening within the space agency. Pretty exciting projects going on. I think the data hub is one of the most exciting ones, and the fact that you're really passionate about making it operational and having a very thriving local data ecosystem makes it really powerful, especially for everyone, for techies, researchers. It will drive innovation for sure. And so I'm very grateful for this conversation. And yeah, until next time, guys, bye, and interact with us on social media. Questions, Charles will be able to answer the questions. We'll direct them to him as soon as we post them across our pages.
We need to do a lot of cut.
I will. Wait, let's take a selfie first.
So I needed to blank out my store in the background.
It's okay. That shows the commitment. Aya, smile. Say please. Thank you, Charles. I'll let you go.
Thank you, man. I have to run. Okay, bye.
Bye.